they laughed. British officers in pressed uniforms, sipping tea in their barracks, laughed when the first Palestinian attacks began in the spring of 1936. To them, it was a passing disturbance, a few angry villagers with old rifles. They believed it would be crushed in days, maybe weeks. But they were wrong. What began as scattered protests would soon evolve into one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings of the 20th century, a revolt that shook the British Empire, crippled its railways, and united a nation that refused to kneel. This is the story of the 1936-1939 Arab Revolt in Palestine, when ordinary Palestinians under British occupation rose against the might of the world's largest empire. They had no air force, no tanks, and no modern army, but they had something far stronger: unity, desperation, and a belief that their homeland was being stolen before their eyes. To understand how this all began, we have to go back to the end of the First World War, when Britain took control of Palestine and laid the foundation for decades of conflict. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, the victors of the war divided its territories. Palestine was handed to Britain under what was called the British Mandate, a colonial administration approved by the League of Nations in 1920. The British presented themselves as bringers of order and civilization. But beneath the speeches and ceremonies, their policies ignited a quiet storm. In 1917, even before they entered Palestine, Britain had already made a promise, the Balfour Declaration. In that letter, the British government pledged its support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. To the Arab inhabitants, who made up over 90% of the population at the time, this was an unthinkable betrayal. Because during the war, Britain had made another promise, one to the Arabs. Through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, British officials had assured Arab leaders that if they rose against the Ottomans, they would gain independence across much of the Middle East, including Palestine. But as soon as the war ended, those promises collided. Britain handed lands to others, redrew maps, and claimed Palestine for itself. The result was a land ruled by outsiders, a colonial government that favored one group's national project while denying the other's right to self-determination. Throughout the 1920s, Britain governed Palestine with a careful but biased hand. Jewish immigration increased steadily, protected by British authority. Settlements grew, land was sold, and Palestinians began to lose both their homes and their voice. British reports from the time recorded the tension, growing unemployment among Arabs, resentment over taxes, and the feeling that their land was being sold under their feet. When Palestinians protested, Britain suppressed them. When they appealed, they were ignored. And when violence broke out, it was their villages that were punished. Still, the British dismissed the discontent as temporary, a natural reaction to progress. They called it jealousy, resistance to modernization. But in truth, it was the early rumbling of a people realizing that they were being displaced. By the early 1930s, Palestinian frustration had reached its breaking point. The rise of Hitler in Europe sent a new wave of Jewish refugees to Palestine, a tragedy for them, but one that the British government managed recklessly. Immigration soared, while Palestinian farmers, unable to compete, were driven off their land. British statistics from the time show that between 1931 and 1936, the Jewish population in Palestine nearly doubled. Land transfers stripped peasants of their livelihoods. Cities like Jaffa and Haifa became centers of unemployment and poverty. All the while, the British turned a blind eye to the consequences. Their military guarded the ports through which new immigrants arrived. Their police arrested Arabs who protested. And their officials continued to insist that everything was under control. But beneath that surface calm, Palestine was boiling. Every village meeting, every sermon, every workers' gathering carried the same message: we are losing our country. And when one man stood up to fight back, everything changed. His name was Sheikh Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, a preacher, teacher, and militant who declared that British rule was an occupation and that resistance was a duty. In 1935, he took to the hills with a small band of followers, attacking British patrols and warning of what was to come. When the British cornered and killed him near Jenin, they thought they had eliminated a nuisance. Instead, they had created a martyr. The death of al-Qassam lit a spark across the country. For Palestinians, he became a symbol, proof that resistance was possible, that words alone would no longer save their land. Less than a year later, that spark would ignite into a full-scale revolt, one that would shut down the entire country, humiliate the British Empire, and leave a mark on history that still echoes today. By early 1936, Palestine was a powder keg waiting for a single spark. Years of broken promises, lost land, and ignored petitions had left the people bitter and desperate. The economy was collapsing under the weight of British taxes and foreign control. Arab farmers, once the backbone of the land, were being driven out by rising land prices and mass purchases by Zionist organizations. British colonial officers called it development. Palestinians called it theft. But what pushed them over the edge wasn't just economics, it was humiliation. Every ship that arrived at the port of Haifa brought in new waves of Jewish immigrants under British protection. Every new settlement reminded Palestinians that they were being replaced. By 1936, nearly 400,000 Jews had settled in Palestine, many fleeing Nazi persecution. And while the immigrants were escaping horror, the way Britain managed it only deepened Palestinian resentment. Villagers watched armed British guards escort new arrivals, while their own homes were demolished for security reasons. Arab workers were fired from jobs and replaced by new immigrants under policies favoring Hebrew labor. The tension was no longer hidden. The killing of Sheikh Izz al-Qassam a year earlier was still raw. His death had become a rallying cry. His followers, known as the Qassamiyun, began small-scale attacks against British patrols and Jewish convoys. To them, al-Qassam was not just a martyr. He was a warning that if they did nothing, their homeland would vanish. Then, in April 1936, the match was struck. A group of Arab rebels ambushed a convoy near Nablus, killing 2 Jewish passengers. In retaliation, Jewish militias attacked Arab villages. British troops responded with harsh raids, arrests, and collective punishments. Within days, the entire country was in turmoil, and from that chaos, something historic was born: the Great Palestinian General Strike of 1936. The strike began in Nablus, then spread like wildfire through Jaffa, Jerusalem, Haifa, and Gaza. Within a week, the entire country had shut down. Shops were closed, trains stopped running, workers, dockers, and taxi drivers walked off the job. It was the first time in modern Arab history that an entire population rose together in peaceful defiance. The message was simple but powerful: no work, no taxes, no cooperation with the British authorities, until justice was done. Palestinian leaders quickly formed the Arab Higher Committee, led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Their demands were clear and limited. 1. An immediate end to Jewish immigration. 2. A ban on land sales to Jewish organizations. 3. The establishment of a national government representing the Arab majority. For 6 long months, Palestine stood still. Farmers refused to send crops to British markets. Railway workers sabotaged lines to block military supplies. Merchants in Jerusalem kept their shutters closed despite enormous financial losses. The strike was so effective that even British newspapers admitted it was paralyzing the country. What began as a protest had turned into a national movement. But the British Empire was not used to being defied, especially not by its colonial subjects. At first, British officials dismissed the strike as emotional unrest. But as it dragged into its 3rd and 4th month, they realized they were facing something much larger. The strike had united Muslims, Christians, and Druze across Palestine. It was no longer just a local protest. It was a revolution against foreign rule. To crush it, Britain used its full colonial toolbox. Soldiers imposed curfews on entire cities. Homes were demolished as punishment for harboring agitators. Hundreds were arrested without trial. In Jaffa, British forces destroyed entire neighborhoods, reducing homes to rubble in a show of force that shocked even some British journalists. Still, the Palestinians refused to surrender. The strike had become a symbol of national dignity. The British turned to a different tactic: diplomacy through pressure. They reached out to Arab kings in neighboring countries, appealing to their loyalty and their dependence on British power. Leaders in Iraq, Transjordan, and Saudi Arabia were persuaded to intervene. They urged the Palestinian leadership to end the strike, promising that Britain would review their demands. By October 1936, after 6 exhausting months, the strike was called off. Palestinians believed that by showing restraint and unity, Britain would finally listen. But the empire had other plans. While the strike ended, the British began preparing for a far more brutal campaign. Behind the scenes, they were bringing in more troops, reinforcing police stations, and gathering intelligence on local leaders. They had no intention of giving in. And so, when the peaceful resistance failed, Palestinians turned to something the British never expected: open rebellion. What followed next was not a protest, it was war. When the strike ended in October 1936, Palestine fell into a tense silence. For a few months, it seemed as if calm had returned. British officials even declared that order has been restored. But beneath that surface, something was changing. The people who had marched, protested, and sacrificed their livelihoods for 6 months had lost faith in peaceful negotiation. They saw that Britain only understood one language: force. And so, by early 1937, the revolt returned, this time not with strikes or petitions, but with rifles, dynamite, and guerrilla warfare. Across the hills of Galilee, the olive groves of Nablus, and the valleys near Hebron, hundreds of small armed groups began to form. They were called fasa'il, or bands, local fighters who knew the land, who could disappear into the mountains and reappear miles away. They were farmers, laborers, former policemen, and students, united by a single goal: to drive out the British and stop the colonization of their homeland. Their weapons were crude: old Ottoman rifles, homemade grenades, smuggled pistols. But their tactics were precise. They targeted railways, telephone lines, and British convoys. They cut supply routes, derailed trains, and ambushed military patrols. Every attack sent a message: Palestine was ungovernable. By mid-1938, the countryside was in open rebellion. British control shrank to fortified cities and garrisons. Travel outside the main roads became dangerous, even for military convoys. At night, rebels controlled entire districts. One British officer wrote in his diary, "We hold the towns by day, but they hold the country by night." The fighters had no central command, but they were coordinated through local leaders. Men like Abd al-Rahim al-Haj Muhammad, a former blacksmith turned commander, and Arif Abd al-Razak, who led daring ambushes against British patrols. Another figure, Fawzi al-Kawukji, a former Ottoman officer, entered Palestine from Syria with a group of volunteers, adding experience and organization to the rebellion. Villages became safe havens. Women and elders provided food and shelter. Blacksmiths forged weapons in secret. The fighters moved through caves, forests, and hills, invisible by day, unstoppable by night. They weren't fighting for empire or wealth. They were fighting for survival, for land, and for a future where Palestinians could govern themselves. To Britain, this was a nightmare. To the Palestinians, it was the first true war of independence. But the British Empire did not crumble easily. It answered with overwhelming force. By the end of 1937, Britain had transformed Palestine into a battlefield. The colonial government declared martial law and began a massive military operation to crush the revolt. Over 20,000 British troops were deployed, supported by 10,000 police. They brought armored cars, machine guns, and bombers. Entire villages were surrounded and searched house by house. The British used collective punishment as a weapon. If a village was suspected of aiding rebels, it was fined, its wells were sealed, and its crops burned. If rebels were found nearby, homes were demolished. Sometimes entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Public hangings became a common sight. Executions were carried out in town squares as warnings to others. In the air, British bombers flew low over villages, dropping leaflets ordering surrender. And if there was no response, they dropped bombs. By 1938, British pilots had carried out hundreds of air raids across Palestine. But even with all this force, the empire struggled. For every rebel killed, 2 more seemed to appear. Railways were blown up again and again. Oil pipelines were destroyed so frequently that engineers began repairing them under armed escort. British commanders grew frustrated. They described the revolt as a running sore that will not heal. Desperate for new tactics, the British turned to the Zionist militias, particularly the Haganah, the largest Jewish paramilitary organization in Palestine. They supplied them with weapons, intelligence, and training. One of the key figures in this cooperation was Orde Wingate, a British officer who admired the Zionist cause. He organized special night squads, joint British-Jewish commando units that carried out nighttime raids on Arab villages suspected of sheltering rebels. They became infamous for their brutality: arrests, beatings, and executions without trial. Through this alliance, the Haganah gained critical combat experience, skills they would later use in the 1948 war. Meanwhile, Britain built fortified police stations, known as Tegart forts, connected by fences, searchlights, and guard towers. It was a colonial counterinsurgency experiment, and Palestine was its testing ground. Every aspect of life was militarized. Movement was restricted, curfews lasted for days. Villagers had to carry identity papers and passes. Food shortages became common as British troops seized supplies. Despite everything, the revolt endured. It adapted. When the British destroyed one group, another rose elsewhere. By late 1938, the rebels had grown bold enough to seize several towns. They took over the old city of Jerusalem for days, forcing Britain to send reinforcements to retake it. Even the main roads connecting Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa became war zones. It was now clear this was no longer a minor colonial disturbance. It was a full-scale rebellion against one of the most powerful empires in history. But as the revolt intensified, Britain was preparing to strike back harder than ever, with new intelligence networks, foreign collaborators, and policies designed not just to defeat the fighters, but to destroy the very spirit of Palestinian resistance. The next phase would be the bloodiest of all. By 1937, Britain could no longer pretend that the situation in Palestine was a minor disturbance. For over a year, its military had been fighting what was effectively a war against farmers, laborers, and villagers who refused to surrender. News of the uprising spread across the world, embarrassing the empire and exposing the fragility of its rule. The rebellion had become one of the longest and most expensive colonial conflicts of the decade. Railways were destroyed, oil pipelines were bombed, and entire regions were ungovernable. The British Parliament demanded answers. The press called it the Palestine problem. And so, in 1937, London sent a high-level commission to investigate, the Peel Commission. Led by Lord William Peel, it toured Palestine, interviewing British officials, Zionist representatives, and Arab leaders. For the first time, a British report openly admitted that the mandate had failed. It stated that the promises Britain made to Jews and Arabs were irreconcilable. The commission proposed something drastic: the partition of Palestine. Under this plan, a small Jewish state would be created along the northern coast and parts of Galilee, while the rest would remain under Arab control. Jerusalem would be placed under permanent British administration. The Zionist leadership, though divided, largely accepted the idea in principle, because it legitimized a Jewish state for the first time. The Palestinians, however, rejected it entirely. To them, it was not compromise. It was dismemberment. They saw it as confirmation that Britain intended to divide their land and hand the best parts to foreign settlers. The Arab Higher Committee declared that Palestine was a single, indivisible homeland, not a map to be carved up in London. When the Peel Commission's proposal became public, outrage swept through Palestine. Meetings, rallies, and strikes reignited. Rebel commanders returned to the hills, launching new attacks. It was clear that Britain had failed to pacify the country, and now, through partition, had made the revolt even stronger. In 1938, the situation reached its peak. British troops faced daily ambushes, railways were destroyed repeatedly, and government authority outside major cities had almost vanished. The revolt had paralyzed the Mandate's administration. Even as far away as India and Egypt, anti-colonial movements watched closely. The Palestinian uprising was being discussed as an example of resistance against empire, a colonial people standing up to one of the world's strongest powers. But inside Britain's War Office, the tone was different. Officials described Palestine as a lesson in what happens when natives are not controlled early. The empire could not afford to appear weak, not with new conflicts brewing in Europe. And so Britain decided to crush the revolt once and for all. By late 1938, the empire unleashed its full strength. Tens of thousands of additional soldiers arrived, bringing armored cars, aircraft, and artillery. The skies above Palestine roared with bombers. The hills echoed with gunfire. Entire towns were locked down. In Jaffa, British engineers used dynamite to clear hundreds of homes, creating open security zones through the heart of the city. In Hebron, entire quarters were demolished in retaliation for rebel attacks. Roads were lined with checkpoints and barbed wire. The policy was simple: destroy the resistance by destroying its environment. British forces also intensified their cooperation with Zionist militias. The Haganah supplied intelligence, guided convoys, and helped identify rebel strongholds. Jewish settlements were armed and fortified, effectively becoming extensions of the British defense network. The countryside, once the rebels' sanctuary, was turning into a trap. By early 1939, the revolt was collapsing under the weight of brutal repression. Key commanders, including Abd al-Rahim al-Haj Muhammad, were killed in battle or captured. Others fled into exile in Syria and Lebanon. Villages suspected of aiding them were bombed and burned. Thousands of Palestinians were imprisoned. Some estimates suggest up to 40,000 arrests during the revolt. Hundreds were executed. Thousands more were exiled or forced to leave their homes. The British had turned Palestine into a laboratory for modern counterinsurgency, with tactics of collective punishment, curfews, aerial surveillance, and detention camps that would later be copied in other colonies. By the spring of 1939, the revolt was effectively over. The hills were silent again, but at a terrible cost. An entire generation of Palestinian leaders had been killed, exiled, or imprisoned. The local political structure, village committees, militias, and unions was shattered. And just as the revolt was dying, the world was sliding toward another catastrophe: the Second World War. Britain, desperate to stabilize the region before the conflict, issued a final policy document, the 1939 White Paper. It promised to limit Jewish immigration and to create an independent Palestinian state within 10 years. On paper, it looked like a concession to Arab demands. But for Palestinians, it came too late. Their leadership was destroyed, their fighters dead or in exile, and their countryside militarily occupied. Britain had promised before and broken every promise that followed. When World War II began later that year, Palestine's fate was no longer in its own hands. The revolt was over, but the wounds it left behind, the destroyed villages, the broken families, the lost leaders, would shape everything that came after. The British Empire had won militarily, but in doing so, it planted the seeds of a deeper tragedy, one that would explode less than a decade later, in 1948. When the guns finally fell silent in 1939, Palestine was unrecognizable. 3 years of rebellion had taken tens of thousands of lives. Entire villages were destroyed, families scattered, crops burned. Britain had regained control, but the cost was staggering. In crushing the revolt, the empire also crushed the foundation of Palestinian political life. Before 1936, the countryside had been full of local leaders: teachers, sheikhs, merchants, farmers, who organized communities and kept society functioning. By 1939, most of them were gone. Many had been killed in combat or executed, others exiled or imprisoned in British camps. Without leadership, the Palestinian national movement was left broken and divided. The British saw this as victory. But in reality, it was the beginning of a far greater disaster. Because while Britain was suppressing Palestinians, it was also strengthening the Zionist movement. Jewish militias, trained and armed under British supervision, had gained crucial experience in intelligence, logistics, and modern warfare. The Haganah, which fought alongside British forces during the revolt, would later form the backbone of the Israeli army in 1948. The infrastructure Britain built to fight the Palestinians, fortified police stations, surveillance systems, and armed settler networks, would all be inherited by the Zionist forces that took over after the mandate ended. Meanwhile, the Palestinian economy lay in ruins. Agricultural lands had been devastated, trade routes were disrupted, and a deep mistrust had settled between Palestinians and their Arab neighbors, who had urged them to end the strike in 1936 and promised British concessions that never came. The revolt had shown the world what Palestinian resistance looked like: disciplined, determined, and rooted in the land. But it also revealed how alone they were. No foreign power came to their aid. No empire defended their cause. The British had proven that brute force could suppress a rebellion, but not erase the idea behind it. Because even in defeat, the 1936-1939 revolt left something lasting: identity. For the first time, Palestinian meant something beyond a place. It meant struggle. It meant defiance against impossible odds. It meant refusing to disappear. Every generation that followed, from the refugees of 1948 to the resistance movements decades later, would carry the memory of that uprising. It became their origin story, their proof that Palestine had once risen together against empire and refused to surrender. The British crushed the revolt, but they never broke the spirit that fueled it. They laughed at first. They called it a small rebellion, a disturbance. They thought it would end in weeks. But the people of Palestine, farmers, workers, and villagers, brought the British Empire to its knees. For 3 years, they shut down the country, defied the world's strongest army, and showed that even under occupation, dignity can fight back. They had no tanks, no air force, no allies, only faith, courage, and unity. And that was enough to shake an empire. The 1936 revolt ended in blood, but its fire never died. It still burns, in memory, in history, and in the unbroken will of a people who refuse to be forgotten.